граница российская, казахстанская. Короче, стоим уже 11 часов, 12 уже, наверное, часов стоим. И еще, наверное, будем стоять.
The transport corridor linking southern Russia with the Kazakh steppe stood as the last stable land route capable of carrying industrial freight, food cargo, and replacement parts across a controlled perimeter of border posts and customs terminals, forming a supply artery that compensated for restricted maritime access and limited western crossings. The geography of the steppe allowed long convoys to move through open areas with minimal detours, while the route's infrastructure relied on refueling zones, inspection platforms and extended parking belts that supported continuous movement of freight columns, and this system functioned without major disruptions until the moment when the transit freeze transformed the entire line into a static formation. The corridor stretched across flat terrain where wind corridors exposed cargo to open air and where support points were spaced far apart, creating a logistical environment that demanded uninterrupted truck flow in order to prevent accumulation at choke points. Under normal load, the route absorbed long convoys by distributing them between border terminals, inland checkpoints, and auxiliary lanes designed for heavy vehicles. The sustained freight pressure increased after maritime restrictions intensified, and the steppe line became the primary channel for goods entering Russian territory from the south and east, carrying essential supplies for industrial clusters around the Volga region and central transport nodes, making the corridor a strategic element within the wider logistics architecture. The route linked distribution centers in Kazakhstan with receiving hubs near Orenburg, Saratov and Samara, forming a chain that fed warehouses responsible for supplying industrial facilities, agricultural operators, and retail networks. When the transit flow remained stable, these hubs maintained balanced reserves that allowed factories to plan production cycles. The transport line served not only as a commercial route but also as a stabilizing mechanism for the internal market, since the corridor delivered machinery components, food shipments, and electronics required for civilian and industrial consumption. Because alternative land lines were either overloaded or partially blocked, the Kazakh corridor carried a disproportionate share of the supply burden. The system relied on predictable inspections, coordinated cargo sequencing and uninterrupted customs clearance that kept freight columns in motion, and the entire structure operated like a long logistical flank with support functions distributed across the steppe. This configuration meant that any sudden obstruction would propagate through every segment of the route, causing rapid congestion at border terminals, forming static truck lines that extended for many kilometers and isolating drivers in open terrain without sheltered areas or reserve staging sites. The unexpected suspension turned the operational corridor into a stationary mass of freight vehicles, and the sheer length of the immobilized line indicated the scale of dependency on this route. The queues expanded along the steppe roads, blocking turnouts, secondary lanes, and emergency shoulders. The freeze immediately affected the inland nodes where warehouses relied on synchronized delivery intervals, and the first signs of strain appeared when distribution centers began reporting gaps in incoming cargo, disrupting the established rhythm of storage rotation. The halt also compromised the internal logistics cycle that transferred cargo from border terminals to deeper transport arteries leading toward central Russia, and as the corridor's throughput collapsed, the entire supply chain became vulnerable to progressive delays and depletion. The situation exposed the fragility of the system's geographic dependence on a single functioning land route and demonstrated how a disruption in the Kazakh steppe could influence markets far beyond the border zone. The region's flat and exposed landscape provided no natural buffering areas where convoys could be reorganized or rerouted, leaving thousands of vehicles trapped in an extended convoy without operational alternatives. The paralysis of the corridor signaled a major shift in the logistics balance, since the collapse of the steppe line removed the last reliable land connection capable of supporting heavy commercial loads into the Russian interior, and this development set the stage for a wider supply crisis that would unfold as distribution centers, industrial hubs, and retail chains began experiencing material shortages. The disruption unfolded as a sequence of administrative and logistical actions that isolated the steppe corridor and halted the movement of freight convoys, beginning with the suspension of transit procedures at Kazakh inspection platforms where customs terminals stopped clearing trucks for departure and where vehicles approaching the line were diverted into temporary holding strips that quickly filled to maximum capacity, transforming the route into a static formation. The freeze originated at the border belt where control posts formed the operational choke points of the corridor, and once the inspection functions were paused, the flow of outgoing vehicles collapsed, leaving long convoys immobilized in open terrain without access to refueling infrastructure or sheltered staging zones, exposing drivers to wind corridors and rapid temperature shifts common to the steppe. The halt created an immediate traffic compression along the main approach lanes, and the accumulation extended through auxiliary roads, emergency shoulders, and bypass paths that normally absorbed overflow traffic. Once these reserves were saturated, trucks lost the ability to maneuver or reconfigure their positions, producing a continuous line that stretched across many kilometers. The corridor's operational rhythm depended on synchronized customs cycles, and when these cycles were interrupted, the entire system experienced a cascading failure that penetrated every node from the Kazakh border to the inland Russian distribution hubs. The immobilized freight included food cargo, machinery components, electronics, and raw materials that required continuous movement to prevent spoilage or exposure to open conditions, and the prolonged standstill compromised refrigeration units, hydraulic systems, and sensitive goods. As the trucks remained stationary, cargo integrity deteriorated, creating additional pressure on logistics operators responsible for maintaining delivery standards. The transit freeze also triggered a communication overload as drivers attempted to coordinate with dispatch units scattered across Kazakhstan and Russia, and the lack of unified routing instructions prevented operators from adjusting schedules or rerouting convoys through distant alternative crossings that lacked the capacity to absorb such volumes. The corridor's infrastructure lacked the redundancy needed to sustain such a disruption, and the steppe offered no natural buffers where trucks could be redistributed into parallel lines or segmented groups. The terrain's openness, normally beneficial for long-haul movement, now exposed the congested formation to environmental stress and logistical stagnation. The sudden immobilization revealed how dependent the corridor had become on predictable customs throughput, and the halt demonstrated that even a short interruption could render the entire route non-functional by freezing the flow of vehicles and isolating thousands of drivers along the steppe belt. As the blockade solidified, the operational structure of the corridor collapsed inward, with border terminals unable to process incoming trucks and inland routes incapable of receiving outbound cargo, effectively severing the logistical chain that connected Kazakh supply lines with Russian receiving hubs. The failure extended beyond the border zone as dispatch centers in Russian territories began reporting discrepancies between expected arrivals and actual movement data, indicating that the corridor's internal mechanisms had ceased to function. The system entered a state of logistical paralysis where convoys remained locked in place and where operational commands could not restore movement without a complete reactivation of the suspended customs operations. The mechanics of the freeze showed that the corridor was highly vulnerable to administrative decisions at key control points, and the sudden halt of clearance procedures created a bottleneck so large that it propagated through the entire length of the route, isolating cargo, immobilizing vehicles, and exposing the fragility of the steppe supply line. The immobilization of the corridor produced immediate field-level consequences across the steppe belt where thousands of freight vehicles formed a continuous stationary mass that blocked the primary and auxiliary lanes, creating conditions in which drivers were unable to reposition, refuel, or offload cargo, and this static formation extended through open terrain where wind exposure, low temperatures, and lack of shelter intensified the operational strain on the personnel trapped along the route. The long lines of trucks transformed the steppe roads into a single congested axis where no vehicle could advance or retreat, and the absence of mobility created a chain reaction that compromised refrigeration units, hydraulic systems, and engine components that required periodic operation to prevent failure. As engines remained inactive, food cargo lost temperature control, machinery parts suffered condensation effects, and agricultural shipments deteriorated under open-air conditions. The obstruction also disrupted access to basic services normally available along the functioning corridor, and drivers positioned far from border terminals had no access to water points, sanitary facilities, or repair stations, leaving them dependent on limited personal reserves and sporadic assistance from vehicles situated closer to designated staging belts. The corridor's design had not accounted for long-term immobilization, and the lack of designated turnaround areas prevented trucks from leaving the line even if operators attempted to withdraw from the route. The static formation created a rigid structure where vehicles could not decompress into secondary paths, leading to complete saturation of every available lane. The congestion also obstructed emergency access routes that normally supported breakdown units and medical responders, and as the trucks formed a continuous chain, support vehicles were unable to reach malfunctioning rigs, leaving stranded drivers without technical assistance. The stationary mass created a series of logistic pockets where engines failed, tires deflated, and refrigerated cargo spoiled, and these pockets began forming intervals of non-operational vehicles embedded within the line, further complicating any potential restoration of flow once clearance procedures resumed. The disruption extended beyond the immediate geography of the steppe as inland Russian warehouses began experiencing shortfalls in expected deliveries, producing gaps in industrial supply chains dependent on Kazakh imports. As incoming shipments failed to arrive, the internal logistics system struggled to redistribute remaining reserves across distribution centers in the Volga region, Siberia, and central Russia. Retail operators reported declining stock levels of imported goods, and the timing of the freeze coincided with already strained maritime routes, exacerbating the supply imbalance. The corridor's failure affected not only consumer markets but also industrial sectors that relied on continuous replenishment of machinery components and raw materials, and factories scheduled to receive shipments from the Kazakh direction began reducing operational cycles due to lack of essential inputs. The immobilized cargo included equipment for agricultural operations, components for assembly lines and raw materials for construction and manufacturing, and the inability to unload or redirect these shipments created a widening disparity between supply requirements and available reserves inside Russia. The field-level conditions along the corridor intensified as temperatures dropped and drivers remained exposed to open winds with no access to shelters or service points, transforming the steppe line into a long-term immobilization zone where operational safety and cargo integrity could no longer be maintained. The accumulation of non-functional vehicles within the stationary mass made the restoration of movement increasingly difficult, as any attempt to restart the line would require clearing multiple equipment failures and reorganizing thousands of trucks along a terrain lacking proper staging areas. The immediate consequences demonstrated that the freeze had not only halted movement but had also created a complex logistical environment in which cargo degradation, equipment breakdowns, and personnel strain compounded the initial obstruction, turning the corridor into a critical zone of operational failure stretching across dozens of kilometers. The collapse of the corridor triggered an immediate response across logistical and administrative structures in both Kazakhstan and Russia, yet the scale of immobilization along the steppe belt limited the effectiveness of every intervention, as support units attempted to navigate a continuous line of stationary trucks that blocked approach lanes and eliminated maneuver space. The border terminals activated contingency protocols that normally applied to short-term congestion, but these procedures relied on the ability to redistribute convoys into auxiliary holding zones, and the saturation of every available segment rendered these measures ineffective. The terrain offered no engineered buffers where vehicles could be diverted, and service units found themselves confined to narrow perimeters around inspection platforms. The Russian side attempted to stabilize the situation by coordinating dispatch centers responsible for receiving freight from Kazakhstan, but the internal communication system provided no mechanism for clearing immobilized trucks positioned deep within the column, and the lack of structural access prevented any reorganization of the line. The congestion blocked logistics corridors used by emergency responders, and the inability of service vehicles to reach malfunctioning rigs created a cascading failure in which broken-down trucks became fixed obstacles embedded within the formation, further constricting the corridor and tightening the immobilized structure into a single elongated blockade. The situation carried a distinct military logic, as the collapse of the corridor mirrored the effects of communication interdiction, where the blockage of a single critical axis propagates operational paralysis across the entire depth of a supply zone. In this case, the frozen line replicated the behavior of a severed logistic flank, and both states were forced to treat the corridor as a non-functional asset requiring containment rather than restoration. The Russian interior regions attempted to compensate by accelerating rail shipments from alternative directions, yet these lines lacked the throughput to replace the halted convoys, and the pressure on inland logistics nodes increased as warehouse inventories began to shrink. The disruption exposed the absence of redundant supply routes and demonstrated that the Kazakh corridor served as a strategic lifeline whose failure could not be offset by internal redistribution. Civilian agencies attempted to deploy mobile service units along the steppe, but the scale of the immobilization exceeded their capacity, and many trucks were positioned in remote segments of the line where access roads were too narrow or too degraded to support relief operations. The weather conditions further complicated efforts, as wind corridors swept across the steppe, reducing visibility and limiting the ability of service personnel to conduct inspections or provide equipment support. The Russian regional administrations issued directives to prioritize fuel deliveries for emergency generators at critical warehouses, as the failure of refrigerated storage would accelerate supply deterioration and increase the strain on already stressed distribution networks. These directives underscored the growing urgency inside the country as internal markets began to feel the ripple effects of the blocked corridor. The situation forced agencies to evaluate the corridor through a framework similar to operational containment, focusing on stabilizing adjacent regions rather than attempting to restore the line itself, since any attempt to reverse the congestion required clearing multiple layers of immobilized vehicles, a task impossible without reactivating transit procedures on the Kazakh side. The steppe corridor remained locked in a static state, and the fragmentation of communication between drivers, dispatch units, and service agencies created information pockets where trucks lacked updated instructions, operational guidance, or estimates for possible clearance. These pockets contributed to a sense of isolated immobilization along the route. The Russian side intensified internal transport rerouting by activating long-haul detours through Orenburg and Chelyabinsk, but these paths lacked the infrastructure to handle sustained freight volumes, and the diversion only relieved a small portion of the supply deficit. The scale of the blockade produced an effect comparable to a logistics standby zone, where the entire freight mass transitioned into a passive state with no functional connection to receiving hubs, and this condition signaled that the corridor had shifted from an operational asset to a strategic liability. The response of both states demonstrated that no rapid recovery mechanism existed for a disruption of this magnitude, and the situation established a new operational reality in which the steppe line remained a frozen axis with no immediate prospect for reactivation. The immobilization of the corridor compelled logistics administrations, regional authorities, and transport agencies to initiate recovery measures, yet the scale of the obstruction limited every attempt to restore movement, and the process evolved into a sequence of constrained interventions aimed at preventing further degradation of cargo and infrastructure. The Russian side sought to reorganize the corridor by deploying engineer units tasked with establishing temporary service lanes along the steppe roads, but the accumulated mass of stationary trucks provided no lateral space for construction equipment to operate, and the terrain lacked stable surfaces for rapid expansion of auxiliary paths. The agencies attempted to segment the column into controllable zones by identifying intervals with incapacitated vehicles, but the continuous structure of the immobilized line prevented isolation of malfunctioning rigs, leaving them embedded in the larger formation and obstructing any controlled withdrawal. The Kazakh authorities focused on stabilizing conditions around their border terminals by increasing personnel at inspection platforms and expanding holding areas, yet the volume of trucks awaiting clearance exceeded the capacity of these zones, forcing vehicles to remain along the main road where no infrastructure existed to support prolonged immobilization. Russian transport operators attempted to relieve pressure by redirecting part of the freight flow toward remote crossings in the Altai and Omsk directions, but these alternative routes were narrow, underdeveloped, and incapable of absorbing significant volumes. The detours introduced additional delays and reinforced the dependence on the blocked steppe corridor. Officials considered deploying pioneer detachments to clear the most degraded segments of the line, focusing on trucks with mechanical failures or spoiled cargo, yet the absence of maneuver space and the density of the formation made removal operations impractical. The authorities explored the option of rerouting isolated groups of trucks through agricultural service paths, but these paths were not engineered for heavy freight and risked structural collapse under prolonged load, and any attempt to use them could strand vehicles deeper in the terrain. Meanwhile, Russian regional administrations activated resource allocation measures to slow the depletion of warehouse inventories, including controlled distribution of essential goods and prioritization of shipments destined for industrial clusters. These actions highlighted the growing strain on internal logistics as factories and retailers reported declining reserves. The inability to restore movement along the corridor led agencies to adopt a containment strategy focused on minimizing further deterioration rather than achieving full reactivation, and they concentrated on supplying isolated drivers with fuel, water, and limited mechanical support delivered from the edges of the frozen line. Emergency responders attempted to access the corridor using light off-road vehicles capable of navigating narrow margins along the steppe, But these efforts reached only a fraction of the immobilized trucks, leaving large segments of the line without support. Russian transit planners analyzed the option of accelerating rail shipments from eastern regions, but national rail infrastructure operated near maximum capacity, and the introduction of additional freight trains risked destabilizing schedules for existing industrial deliveries. The persistent immobilization revealed deficiencies in contingency planning for high-volume land routes, and the authorities gradually recognized that the corridor could not be restored until Kazakhstan reactivated full transit operations. This dependency shifted strategic focus toward diplomatic and administrative negotiations aimed at resolving the freeze. The prolonged effort to control the situation underscored the limitations of local recovery measures, as the scale of the blockage surpassed the capabilities of regional agencies and demonstrated that the corridor had transitioned into a long-term immobilization zone requiring coordinated action across multiple logistical and administrative structures. The measures deployed along the steppe reduced some of the immediate operational risks but failed to restore movement, reaffirming that the solution lay not in tactical interventions but in the full reopening of the Kazakh transit belt, without which the corridor would remain a static axis with mounting logistical and economic consequences. The prolonged immobilization of the Kazakh corridor solidified into a stable operational state in which the route no longer functioned as a transit artery but instead as an extended static zone composed of thousands of trucks, degraded infrastructure segments and intermittent service pockets, and this transformation reshaped logistics planning across both territories. The corridor assumed the characteristics of a long-term standby belt, where freight no longer moved toward Russian receiving hubs and instead accumulated in layers along the steppe, forming a stationary mass that persisted despite multiple attempts at reorganization. The border terminals reduced their operational tempo to minimal maintenance functions, as the absence of outbound clearance eliminated the need for continuous inspection cycles, and personnel shifted to monitoring tasks focused on safety, cargo preservation, and controlled access to the immobilized zones. Russian distribution centers began restructuring internal supply patterns by reallocating remaining inventory reserves toward priority industrial sectors, focusing on energy, food processing, and essential manufacturing, and this redistribution signaled that the system had transitioned from temporary adaptation to sustained deficit management. Retail networks adjusted procurement strategies by substituting imported goods with lower-volume domestic alternatives, yet the internal market lacked the production capacity to fully offset the withdrawal of supplies that normally arrive through the steppe corridor. This imbalance manifested in shrinking stock levels and extended delivery intervals across urban and regional centers. The immobilized trucks formed a continuous infrastructure burden, as engines, refrigeration units, and hydraulic systems failed in increasing numbers, creating long stretches of non-operational vehicles that further complicated any future attempt to reactivate the corridor. Service teams positioned at accessible perimeter points provided minimal support, focusing on preventing hazardous cargo deterioration and maintaining a basic operational perimeter around the most vulnerable segments of the line. Inside Russia, regional administrations implemented controlled distribution regimes for select goods to prevent rapid depletion of warehouse reserves, and these measures indicated that the economic system had entered a phase of structured rationing designed to prolong remaining supplies. Factories dependent on machinery components and imported materials began revising production schedules, scaling down output where replacement parts were unavailable and consolidating operations in sectors with sufficient reserves to maintain short-term continuity, effectively reducing overall industrial capacity. The corridor's paralysis also affected long-range transportation balance, as rail and road systems attempted to absorb redirected freight from alternative directions. These secondary networks operated near maximum thresholds and lacked the infrastructure to compensate for the prolonged absence of the Kazakh supply line. The steppe route, once a critical logistics flank, now functioned as an inert axis requiring continuous monitoring rather than restoration, and agencies shifted their focus from recovery operations to containment protocols designed to prevent further infrastructure degradation. The static formation of trucks created new operational hazards, including structural fatigue in road surfaces beneath immobilized vehicles and localized soil compression in areas where heavy rigs remained stationary for extended periods. These factors indicated that even after a potential reopening, the corridor would require significant reconstruction before regaining full capacity. Communication between drivers, dispatch units, and authorities stabilized into a pattern of periodic status updates without operational progress, reflecting the entrenched nature of the freeze and the limited scope of actionable decisions. The long-term immobilization exposed structural weaknesses in route design, including the absence of redundant corridors, insufficient staging belts and lack of engineered detours, and these shortcomings influenced broader logistical planning across Russian regions as agencies began evaluating the need for alternative transit axes capable of sustaining heavy freight volumes. The corridor's fixed state established a new logistical environment in which the Kazakh steppe no longer served as a conduit for goods but as an extended symbol of supply chain vulnerability, and the enduring nature of the freeze signaled that the system had entered a prolonged phase of constrained movement and structural recalibration. The collapse of the Kazakh corridor redefined the strategic logistics landscape by exposing the extent to which Russian supply chains depended on a single functioning land route and by demonstrating how the interruption of one axis could propagate structural disruption across the entire depth of the national economy. The immobilization transformed an operational transport line into a static zone that no longer supported freight movement and instead served as a visible indicator of logistical fragility. The prolonged freeze revealed the absence of redundant corridors capable of absorbing redirected traffic, showing that the system relied on linear flows rather than distributed networks and that the loss of the steppe line created a vacuum in which alternative routes lacked both infrastructure and throughput. The sustained paralysis of thousands of trucks, combined with cargo degradation and equipment failure, demonstrated that the corridor's recovery would require not only administrative reactivation but also physical reconstruction of road surfaces and inspection platforms, as extended immobilization imposed structural strain on the underlying infrastructure. The internal Russian market began to operate under conditions of constrained inventory, where distribution centers shifted from scheduled replenishment cycles to controlled allocation of remaining reserves, and this adjustment marked a transition from adaptive logistics to a persistent deficit model. Industrial sectors dependent on imported components reduced output and consolidated operations, altering national production capacity and disrupting manufacturing cycles in regions tied to the Kazakh route. Retail networks experienced elongated delivery intervals, shrinking stock levels and increased dependence on lower-capacity domestic substitutes, and these consequences signaled a shift in consumer markets toward restricted availability and prolonged supply gaps. The situation also demonstrated the operational weakness of Russian long-haul logistics, as rail systems lacked the free capacity to offset the absence of the steppe route and road networks in alternative regions were not engineered for sustained heavy freight loads. The corridor's failure emphasized the strategic vulnerability created by reliance on a single uninterrupted supply path and highlighted the absence of a layered logistic structure capable of maintaining stability under stress. The immobilization served as a practical example of how a disruption at one choke point could influence industrial operations, market dynamics, and regional administration planning across the entire country. The Kazakh freeze also influenced geopolitical calculations, as the sudden breakdown of the corridor underscored the limits of Russia's ability to secure consistent overland supply channels and demonstrated that logistical resilience required cooperative frameworks that exceeded national capacities. The immobilized trucks, stranded in the steppe over extended distances, became a visible representation of the broader fragility of the logistics network, illustrating how supply chains could transition from functioning assets to static burdens when critical corridors failed. The situation forced Russian agencies to revisit the structural design of national logistics planning, prompting evaluations of new transit axes, additional staging belts and potential investment in alternative cross-border links, yet the immediate consequences remained tied to the degraded state of the corridor. The freeze marked a turning point in operational logistics by showing that the country's supply system could be destabilized without physical interdiction or direct infrastructure damage. The administrative decision that halted the corridor proved sufficient to trigger a chain reaction leading to shortages, production slowdowns, and internal rationing measures. The long-term implications of the immobilization extended beyond immediate economic effects, as the corridor's collapse established a precedent for how rapidly a logistics lifeline could transform into a structural liability. The Kazakh steppe, once a functioning conduit for goods, evolved into a symbol of supply chain vulnerability, and the enduring stagnation of freight along the route demonstrated the fragility of a logistics network that lacked depth, redundancy, and adaptive flexibility.